more about JustCom's mission of evangelization and education, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and our website, justcom.ph. To give a face to the faceless and a voice to the voiceless, that we may recognize Christ in them and hear His story in theirs.
Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, radyo, Katipunan. Radyo, radyo, Katipunan.
Mga Katipuneros, it's time to level up! Your talk variety program showcasing the best in media and other fields. As we feature the most loved personalities and the best practices of what we truly refer to as Magis. Together with multi-awarded multimedia guru Mr. Noel Ferrer, let's all level up every Friday from 3 to 6 p.m. here on Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM.
Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Voice of the Blue Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay atin misna sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng pera. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, Katipunero sugo, todo sa kayod, punong at tulong. Lipad na Blue Eagle, galing hiding at tigil, blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, 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 Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede?
Baka naman pwede.
Mga isyung napapanahon ating pag-usapan.
Baka naman pwede.
Gamit ang mga pananaw mula sa iba't ibang kalinangan.
Baka naman pwede.
Mula sa Institute of Philippine Culture, kami inyong samahan, tayo'y maghuntahan. Dito lang sa
Baka naman pwede.
tuwing Huwebes, alas 3 ng hapon, dito lang sa Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM.
Magandang hapon sa lahat. Nakikinig kayo ngayon lahat sa Baka Naman Pwede, isang programa ng Institute of Philippine Culture at ng Radyo Katipunan na naglalayong pagnilayan ang mga napapanahong issue gamit ang lente ng agham panlipunan o ng social sciences. Nais din natin mapag-usapan ang bagay na baka naman pwede nating tingnan. Muli, pag-ukulan ng pansin at aksyonan. Ako si Elissa at ako ngayon ay magiging host ninyo para sa hapong ito. Kamusta naman po kayong lahat? Please feel free to share the live stream at itagan inyong mga kaibigan at pamilya para manood ng episode natin ngayong hapon. Nung nakaarang Huwebes, napag-usapan natin ang ayudang Pilipino at kung ano ang isang makataong pagtugon sa mga hamon ng panahon. Nakasama natin sina Dr. Leslie Lopez at Miss Georgina Hernandez Yang ng Galing Pook Foundation. Napag-usapan nila ang mga best practices ng LGU sa disaster response at kung paano ito mas maipabubuti. Naalala ko pati yung current pandemic, no? Ano yung mga na natutunan sa siguro mga mahigit kumulang 2 taon nagpagbigay ng ayuda in the context of disaster response and the pandemic. Para balikan ng kwentuhan ito, bisitahin lamang ang Facebook page ng Radyo Katipunan at ng Institute of Philippine Culture. For this week's episode, pag-uusapan natin ang kapasidad, Katatagan at Katarungan sa Kalamidad. With us today is a postdoctoral research fellow from the University of Canberra, Dr. Justin C. Hello, Justin.
Hello, Melissa. Hello po sa lahat ng mga nakikinig.
Old
Magandang
friend rin tong si Justin ng IPC at ng DSA at ng SOS. So he is not a stranger to our community. And para sa ating mga viewers sa Facebook, pwede kayong sumali sa ating kwentuhan. Feel free to leave comments and questions during the discussion, and we will be reading them during the Q&A portion. So before we start, please allow me, and it is an honor to do so, to introduce our guest for this afternoon. Dr. Justin C. is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Sustainable Communities, or CSC, at the University of Canberra. His research centers around the issues of justice, vulnerability, climate adaptation, and post-development, particularly in urban and coastal communities in the Philippines. He has recently finished his PhD in Community Planning and Development at La Trobe University, and he did his fieldwork in Iloilo, where he looked at issues of justice and climate change adaptation interventions. He has published his work in international climate change journals, such as the Global Environmental Change, Climate Change and Climate and Development, and he is also the recipient of the 2020 International Student of the Year at the Victorian International Education Awards in Australia. Wow, busy! Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Justin C. Magandang hapon po, Dr. C.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lau, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm very, very happy to be here. Sabi mo nga, it's been a long time. Nagkikita pa tayo dati sa DSA.
Parang
Dr.
kalin mo,
Dr.
nakaupo
Corio.
lang tayo sa pink sofa ng DSA at nangangapit bahay. But here we are now in a very different setting, and I'm glad to see that you have made good time. No? Kailan ka umalis ng
2017 po. 2017.
Matagal na pala yung yung tambayan na yun. And here you are in 2022, and a lot of accomplishments indeed, and I think a lot of learnings to be shared in this hour. So, yung susunod ko na tanong ay, kamusta po kayo and what keeps you busy these days? Ayun, before we go into the questions that have been set for this.
Mabuti naman po, really relieved na natapos po natin ang ating PhD. Inabutan tayo ng pandemic, pero sa awa ng Diyos, nagawa po natin. And so what keeps me busy these days is really yung trabaho ko po as a postdoctoral research fellow dito po sa Center for Sustainable Communities. Titingnan po natin yung how can we yung parang ma-promote itong mga assets, trends ng mga people towards more sustainable practices po, especially in adapting to climate change. So it's all just very parang more than 10 years in the making, I suppose, from doing my bachelor's in Ateneo to master's into PhD and now to postdoc.
Ayun. And since na-mention mo yung bachelor's mo in Ateneo, I'm going to ask you, and I know the answer to this, no? It's been quite a journey. Your bachelor in Ateneo, your undergrad, is actually not in the social sciences. You mentioned earlier that you actually have a background in physics.
Opo. So, I wasn't into climate change. I wasn't into sociology, anthropology before kasi nga parang I love numbers, math, ganyan. But I think that Atenean in me wanted to, parang ayoko na sa lab lang. Gusto ko to really understand society, to make a contribution to society. And that opportunity came when Dr. Emma Porio of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology offered me a scholarship to do a master's degree in sociology under this Coastal Cities at Risk project. That's partnership between Ateneo de Manila and Manila Observatory. So doon po nag-start yung research on climate change. Together with Dr. Porio, we looked at vulnerabilities, tried to understand the concept in Metro Manila, Ganun po, doon po nag-start yun. Hanggang sa ngayon, yun pa rin yung inaaral ko. So it's been like 10 years now.
In other words, Kalad Karen. We all start as Kalad Karen. And you made that it's not really, hindi lang siya tawid eh. Medyo may pagkalundag rin siya, no? From the natural sciences to the social sciences. And the wonderful work that you've been talking about, or you just talked about, has a little bit to do with indicators, right? Developing indicators for looking at climate change adaptation. Baka you can share a little bit of the early work before we jump into the questions for the day.
Correct. Doon po kami nag-start, no, looking at yung mga indicators of vulnerability kasi we want to see what makes people, especially in yung mga urban poor communities, vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So doon po nag-start. After this, na-identify po namin itong mga indicators. We use statistics, we use mapping para ma-map out po natin over space, no, kung para malaman natin saan ba yung mga pinaka at risk pagdating sa climate change as a disasters. Para, in terms of policy, mabigyan natin ng pansin yun. Mas mabuti.
And that's the wonderful ending that we all hope for. That these indicators, this mapping of vulnerabilities, this new understanding or layers of understanding of climate change will eventually make its way to decision makers for evidence-based decision making. Nasingit rin ng political science, so shout out rin naman sa disiplina ko. Ayun. So dahil parang marami yata tayong mako-cover na ground kasi kung saan tayo tumambay ng kabataan natin, let's move on now to the questions for this session. So bilang panimula, baka naman pwede nyo po muna kaming kwentuhan tungkol sa research, no? So let's look a little bit more at what you've been doing since then. Tungkol sa climate change adaptation interventions. So I guess the key questions are, what is the role of social sciences in formulating solutions for climate change or through climate change adaptation? Can you share some examples of your current or previous work in this area? And how does social science research feed into policy or programs on the ground? Ayan, I'd love to hear about what you found out, especially now that you're working in our own communities, no, in Iloilo, for example. And what are some improvements that can be made to our existing policies and programs related to climate change? And how can these be lobbied for? Ayan. So baka we want to go through them one by one. That might be the best way to go about it. Ayun. So, that shift, no, we were talking about earlier, nagaling ka sa physics, tapos biglang nakasingit si social science. And what good really has this brought you in terms of understanding climate change and formulating solutions for it?
Yung physics talaga nakatulong yung discipline, especially yung disiplina, yung methods, yung tools, nakatulong siya, no. But then magugulat kayo na ngayon na nag-PhD ako, medyo may shift na naman from vulnerability to adaptation, to climate change adaptation. And pag sinabi kong climate change adaptation, this is what I mean, that it refers to these processes and actions that people do to prepare for actual or expected impacts ng climate change. So from being vulnerability, ngayon titingnan ko naman yung adaptation, yung mga interventions, yung mga projects, yung mga programs. So halimbawa, yung mga infrastructures, di ba, like seawalls, like sea dikes, capacity building programs to help people respond, yung mga warning, monitoring systems, yung mga ecosystems-based adaptation. So these kinds of measures yung titingnan natin. Naging interested ako sa Iloilo kasi Iloilo is very vulnerable to climate change. It has been subjected to different programs by NGOs, by multilateral institutions like USAID, by the government. So as a social scientist na pumunta doon, I was interested in the impacts of these programs on people's lives. So tinitingnan ko, nakatulong ba yung mga program na to sa buhay ng mga tao? Ano ba yung mga best practices? What works best? At the same time, hindi lang puro positive yung tinignan ko. Titingnan ko rin ano ba yung mga issues na kinaharap ng mga tao. Ano yung mga naging problema? Ano yung mga epekto nito sa mga tao? So I was looking at the politics, I was looking at the dynamics of the adaptation programs, but at the same time, minamap out ko rin po yung mga existing practices and strategies and activities ng mga tao on their own. Paano ba sila nagre-respond to adaptation without the help of with external institutions, sa kanila lang, on their own. And I realized that people, especially yung mga doon po sa coastal areas po sa Iloilo, they have their own means of adapting, they have their own personal networks, they rely on the knowledges that have been passed on to them from their parents and from their parents, and that these strategies complement yung mga current adaptation strategies po in a meaningful way. So yun po naging advocacy ko sa aking dissertation na when we talk about people, when we talk about Filipinos, hindi lang po tayo victims ng climate change. Naniniwala po ako sa performativity ng language na kung ano po yung sinasabi natin, nagiging totoo po yun. So that's why yung mga nakita natin sa news, it's very limited. And that's why social scientists like us, we're here. We're here to bring out the other side of the story na yung ano ba yung mga strengths, ano ba yung mga assets ng mga community na mga nandun. At hindi lang sila victims.
Kinuha na ni Justin sa back pocket yung performativity. Ayun na. Ito na ang social scientist. Pero one thing that we're talking about right now is climate change. And then there's also DRR. And I'd like to know, what have you heard are the local understandings of climate change? Kasi maraming nakakaintindi talaga ng disaster risk reduction. In fact, this is what is more central, I think, to the languaging, especially of government policy. But climate change is different. Climate change adaptations are separate. So how do communities understand that separately, or even in relation to?
Even though meron po mga intersections yan, for sure meron mga magkakasimilarities. I think ang pag sinabi natin climate change adaptation, apaka hindi ng mga tao dito is ito yung long term na hindi ito parang pag nangyaring disaster, ano yung gagawin natin? Kasi alam nila na DRR yun. That's a response. So when we talk about adaptation, this is really preparing for several years in the making. So pag sinabing gagawa sila ng mga infrastructures o ng mga trainings o ng mga green infrastructures, like for example yung mga pagtatanim ng mga puno, ng mga mangroves to protect them, I think ganun yung pagkakaintindi ng mga tao. This is long term. Long term pinag-usapan natin pag sinabi nating adaptation. But then
no, go ahead.
Say what I realize is that itong the question that the role of social sciences has in climate disasters, malaki talaga yung role na ginagampanan nating mga social scientists. Kasi kung titingnan natin yung history ng climate change, nagsimula yan, tinitingnan natin yung mga disasters as a natural phenomenon. We see this in the works of scholars like sila Gilbert White, sila Ian Burton. Sinasabi nila parang they look at hazards in terms of hazards in terms of like gaano ba kataas yung sea level rise, gaano ba kadalas yung bagyo, gaano ba ka-intense yan, saan ba tatama yan. So karaniwan sa mga solusyon dyan is mga tinatawag nating technocratic, yung better infrastructures, building seawalls, early warning systems. Ito po yung tinatawag ni Mark Pelling na incremental, maliliit na adaptation to climate change. But then in the 1980s po nagkaroon ng shift, nadagdagan yung pag-iisip ng mga tao sa climate change na hindi lang siya natural kasi tinitingnan din natin yung social, yung political, yung economic processes. And dito po pumapasok yung mga political economists tulad nila Michael Watts na he looked at famine, he looked at drought in Nigeria, and sabi niya, bakit kaya yung mga tao dito nagugutom? In the first place, they have access to land, they have a rich, a lot of resources, but then why are they hungry? And nakita niya yung mga interventions, yung mga programs na dinala sa area nila, actually eroded the local knowledge and the local practices ng mga tao. And imbis na makatulong, nangyari, mas lumala yung situation. And in the term of climate change, we call it maladaptation. So, imbis na naging naka-adapt, parang lumala yung situation.
Parang
so,
matras pa.
Matras pa. So, ano yung role ng social sciences? First, we're here to question this taken for granted knowledge about climate change adaptation. And we're here to ask these uncomfortable questions. Ano ba yung impacts ng disasters, ng mga interventions? Ito mahirap tanongin. Sino ba ang nakikinabang dito? Whose expense? Bakit sila nakikinabang? Bakit yung iba hindi? And these questions are the heart of what we call climate justice. So that's one. And second, social sciences, I believe, can help uncover itong mga strengths, yung mga assets ng mga communities that in responding to climate change. We have to remember that hindi na sa atin bago yung bagyo, di ba? Parang every year na lang yan. Yes, it's become worse due to climate change. Mas naging intense, mas naging severe. But then people have been responding to this harsh environment for years, di ba? So social sciences will help uncover these kinds of practices that people have been doing for decades, for centuries to sustain themselves and to flourish. So that when we plan for things in the future, hindi natin siya parang pinipilit na lang because this is what other countries do or this is what our donors want, but this is because this is what the communities are good at. So it becomes locally based and context specific.
Those are wonderful interventions indeed. And I think our listeners and our viewers will take away much just from what you just said there, understanding a little bit more about the human element in climate change and what are the different factors that may make or break communities, regions, entire countries.
And Melissa, kailan kung okay lang, ibibida ko rin yung methodologies natin. Kasi,
sure, go ahead.
kasi hindi madali eh. Hindi madali yung ginagawa ng mga social scientists. From my experience, medyo, di ba pag tinitingnan mo yung mga palabas na mga Big Bang Theory, for example, kung saan yung parang golden standard nila is, di ba, physics, chemistry, which is okay lang, magaling talaga yung ganong natural sciences. But then, you have to understand that social sciences, we're dealing with people. And people can be very unpredictable. And so our methods, di ba, in our methods, yung mga ethnography, surveys, interviews, observations, hindi yan madaling gawin kasi it takes time.
Mabusisi social sciences. Yun lang yun. There's a different kind of rigor, I think, to the social sciences.
In fact, when I did my fieldwork in Iloilo, nag-spend ako doon for, I think, 4 or 5 months. In fact, maiksi pa nga yun eh. Di ba? Iba nag-fieldwork ng years. So, social scientists, you really have to spend time. You have to build rapport with the communities. You have to sacrifice then, time spent away from family. So, these kinds of things.
And that's where the great, I think, common understanding comes. When there is sufficient time in communities, and the understanding is really the same on the part of the researcher and the community. And on that note, yak segue, you mentioned Iloilo. Maybe you can share some of the examples of your current or previous work here that you'd like to highlight in terms of what you talked about, climate justice, climate change adaptations in the Philippine context.
So, parang siguro yung concept of justice. Kasi, ano ba yung adaptation justice? What can be considered fair when responding to mga disasters? And what I've seen in my fieldwork in Iloilo is it's not that easy to achieve justice. Kasi there are a lot of things that we need to take into consideration. Yung concept of climate justice, na-realize ko, parang parang pyramid. Parang triangle siya. So in the middle ng pyramid, nandiyan yung tinatawag natin na procedural justice. And you'll be familiar with this, Melissa, kasi political science.
Procedural justice.
Nancy Fraser. So yun sa gitna. Di ba? Procedural justice. So these are the making sure that people are given the opportunities to be involved, di ba? To influence decision making.
That's a very
participation, di ba?
Yes.
But then hindi pala enough na they participate. Kailangan sa ilalim ng pyramid, merong recognition. Yan tinatawag natin na recognitional justice. We have to recognize their voices. Their voices are heard and respected. So para ma-achieve mo yung procedural justice, kailangan mo ng recognitional justice. So ni-recognize mo dapat hindi lang yung mga malapit kay mayor, yung mga powerful sa community, yung mga may kaya, kundi everyone, especially yung mga marginalized and vulnerable groups. Dapat hindi selective. And finally, so meron kang recognitional, meron kang procedural. Sa taas, doon yung distributive na the fair allocation of benefits, which pag na-meet mo yung recognitional and procedural, yung distributive will just easily flow. Parang darating na yung susunod na yun. So, na-realize ko sa fieldwork sa Iloilo is mahirap pala ma-achieve yung ganun kasi ang dami mong kailangang parang requirements or kailangan tignan para makuha mo yun. So
you mentioned recognition, no? Recognition by whom? Sino yung dapat mag-recognize? Or what recognition do you see as most missing, or most absent?
So for me, recognition talaga ng kung sino man yung number one, yung mga practitioners natin, sino yung mga nag-implement itong mga programs on the ground. Pangalawa, sino yung mga may hawak ng mga finances, ng mga funding, so at nagma-monitor nito. So for example, government and donors. And recognition of whom? Of the voices of the most vulnerable people in the community. So we're talking about the elderly, the women, the children, the sick, the disabled. So all of this, kailangan meron din silang say sa planning nitong mga programa for climate change adaptation.
And have you seen any potential platforms in Iloilo which sort of characterizes the recognition and the procedural justice, which may lead to, as you said, no, redistribution also?
Certainly meron. Pwede ko ba sabihin?
Hindi ko alam. Meron ba tayo? Kung parang maybe just the platform, I guess, what are the things that you've seen that's already taking place?
Well, naman sila they're well published. Marami na nasulat about them. So, sila talagang in-empower. Pwede naman sige sabihin, homeless.
Naman, if it's a good practice, yes. Let it
So really, nakita ko yung sa practice ng Homeless People's Federation. Yan, sa Iloilo. Kasi talagang in-empower nila yung communities na talagang may say yung mga tao from the very start. Just, planning their house, from construction, from procuring of materials, everything, their part. So, kumbaga, pasok na agad yung recognitional and procedural justice. Tapos, yun. So, so yun nga, I'm writing a paper about it because it's a good case study din. Parang gusto natin i-share kung ano yung mga ginagawa nilang maganda.
And, parang that moves me now to the next arena of engagement, which is also the second bullet point if you want to follow along. It is, we have these best practices, we have these good cases, but what we want is a certain scale, no? What we want also is for it to make sure that it actually can be replicated or can be used by different communities in the same situation as well. So how does social science research, like what you do, feed into policies and programs on the ground? So how do we get one of the most difficult things I find, though, in our line of work is to do good work with communities and to find potential solutions, but the buy-in or the selling to let's say decision makers can sometimes be an uphill climb. So do you have any comment or experience on this?
Sabi nga ni magko-quote ako ng isang physicist.
Balik science.
Sabi ni Einstein, meron siyang parang quote na we cannot parang find the answers to the problems using the same level of thinking in which we see the problem, diba? I think it applies to the case of climate change adaptation. I believe that for years we've been focused on treating it as a natural, as a technical problem, and we've been utilizing the same solutions and interventions for the past several years. I mean, the problem is little has changed, and so we need a new lens. We need a different perspective. And so I think this is where the social science perspective will come in. Kasi it will give us this new kind of lens to see communities in a different way. Mahirap yung tanong kasi hindi ko masabi kung what works.
Hindi ko masabi kung sino yung mga local government official na kasi election ngayon. Matechnical pa tayo.
At saka yung kasi minisa yung replicating it to different communities. Parang for me medyo sa akin kasi naniniwala ako na it can work with some but it may not work in others. So for me kaya kailangan talaga ng social science kasi kailangan mo talaga understanding in depth of a certain community, of a certain area bago mo gawin yung implementation na yan or yung intervention na yan. I think you need to do research. So yun nga, pag meron ka ng empirical research, then it will feed into the ground. But then in the literature, apparently meron palang different modes of this nexus between policy and practice, research and policy. So the more conventional, the more traditional approach is yun nga, yung research shaping policy. Merong research question, merong research gap, and gagawa yung tao ng research to be able to shape policy. However, ang limit ito, sa tingin ko lang is that ang mga researchers, yung mga practitioners, parang nasa kanya-kanyang silos. Yung mga community members, parang kanya-kanyang silos, di ba? And the planning of the programs usually occur in places where the actions will not be implemented. Parang malayo. So, for me, kung ako tatanungin, ano yung best practice ito is what we call action-oriented and participatory research. Yan, yung PAR.
PAR. Ayan,
Yung
shout
PAR.
out na kay IPC. PAR.
Ayan. Oh, perfect talaga. Kasi di ba yung PAR, co-production yan and co-creation.
Yeah, co-production of knowledge. Correct. Yeah.
So, for me, pag nag-PAR tayo, we are breaking down that silo. So, this approach will really help us generate insights and knowledge into what, would not be available kung we just do it on our own. Na ganun. So yun, action-oriented, it's mission-driven to bring about this positive change for community. So yun, for me, yun yung best practice.
Another great intervention. And talagang swerte ka na lang kung makahanap ka ng isang local government official, isang local chief executive na naiintindihan yung innate value ng PAR. At ang importante siya talaga ng buy-in ng communities.
Yung PAR kasi it takes time, di ba? Like years. But the problem is limited yung time ng mga government officials natin in office. So kaya talagang mahirap yung buy-in na yan. So hopefully kung yan tatanungin niyo ako mamaya, baka naman pwede. Yun yung isa sa mga ano ko.
Mamaya na yun.
Okay.
Mamaya na yun. Parang si Dr. Poro So parang, I think one of the things that we can look into also are the existing networks, between academic centers in these areas and policy making. Ayun, kung saan nandyan yung mga local or yung state universities or yung mga Ateneos or whatever, there's usually a community of academics who are highly engaged also in the issues in that area, and sometimes that's where the best kind of work comes out. So really a strong push for collaboration. Ayun. And then the last question on the board: how are some improvements that can be made to our existing policies and programs related to climate change? So how can we lobby for these improvements? What are some of the improvements that can be made to our existing policies and programs related to climate change? O magpa-ano ka na daw dyan? Magpa-policy,
Policy, naman.
Mag-policy brief ka na dyan. So, how can these be lobbied for?
For me,
way forward.
May three things ako naisip Yung first one is a bit radical. Kasi for me, di ba, over the years, parang sobrang focus tayo on incremental adaptation. I think that we should give a little more focus on what we call transformative adaptation. So yes, nakakatulong yung current programs natin, current actions, they try to address the impacts of climate change. We want to avert, we want to minimize loss and damage. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think kailangan din natin i-address what brings about this vulnerability, this poverty, these inequalities in the first place. So we have to look at yung tinatawag natin na structural justice Parang yung historical, yung parang long processes of long process that made some people more more vulnerable compared to others. So yun yung mahirap kasing gawin yun and that's why we need social sciences to be able to do that. So paano natin gagawin yun? For me, we have to do more analysis of politics, political science and power across different scales. I think that kailangan natin i-uncover itong mga complex web of power structures, di ba? That are shaped by adaptation decisions. We need to ask these difficult questions talaga. Why are some people able to participate? Why are some people unable to participate? No? Bakit may mga uneven outcomes? Who possesses more power and influence compared to others? And how come do they have this over others? So these questions are difficult to answer, but if you can find a way to take this into consideration, I believe that we're on our way to crafting more fair and more just policies and programs. So that's one.
I cannot say no, that's not right, because power, yes, correct.
Power and politics.
Power and politics, yes.
Second, how do we bring to the fore? Paano ba natin papalabasin yung mga capabilities, yung mga assets, yung mga strengths ng mga people that are already there in adapting to climate change. In the Philippines, as you know, ang work kasi ng disaster risk reduction is coordinated in the OCD. And usually ba OCD parang military background in direction. So the way they view disasters before, I think, is in terms of shocks, di ba? So kung shock yan, what are you going to do? So very, top down yung mga solutions and all that. But one thing that we need to consider is how do we bring these initiatives, yung mga bottom up naman. And I guess that's where the NGOs and the civil societies work becomes really, really important. And from what I know, Coastal Cities at Risk Project is trying to make that collaboration between the NGOs, between civil society, between the government, between the private sector, to collaborate for more transformative actions for climate change adaptation. So I guess, we need more of these kinds of projects na nag-work together and nagkakaintindihan, sabi mo nga, yung mga different sectors.
Okay na naman munang hindi magkaintindihan. I think there's a point of contention and conversation that takes place, especially if there are many actors, no? But the important point, as you said, is that they are heard. Correct. Lahat yan.
So not necessarily consensus building, kundi just being able to express
express themselves in a forum where everyone comes to the table. Medyo mahirap rin yan, ha? Parang easier, those are one of the things that easier said than done.
Kasi nga daw, di ba, yung consensus building can be a form of violence. Parang, di ba, kung sino lang yung mas powerful dyan nung may masasabi. Tapos lastly, I guess, yung how do we balance, ito yung medyo, how do we balance science, which is good, scientific knowledge, alongside yung mga local, traditional, indigenous forms of knowledge.
Yes.
Di ba, kasi itong mga communities, indigenous communities, they've been responding to the environment for several decades. Centuries pa, di ba? So, I guess that's one of the questions that we have to ask. How do we reframe? Paano ba natin babaguhin yung mga policies? Hindi naman babaguhin, pero paano ba natin i-reframe? Paano ba ito Tagalogin? Reframe ang ating mga policies para ma-recognize natin and ma-value itong mga different ways of adapting, of knowing, of acting related to climate change. Kasi pag ginawa natin yun, then we'll see that building infrastructures, di ba, relocating people, hindi lang ito yung mga solutions. Napakarami. We have so much to learn from the indigenous communities. In fact, right now, I'm writing a paper. I'm partnering with scholars in Vietnam, in Fiji, in Nepal, kasi, ang grabe yung very rich yung na-documented ng indigenous adaptation strategies nila. And
wonderful.
And sa Philippines, meron din. So this would be really exciting.
I'd be interested to see the eventual product of that study, and whether or not there are similarities also, not just differences, but similarities also across the region in terms of indigenous knowledge. Maingay na yung chat box.
Hala, sige, what's happening?
Teka lang, tatlong points mo, no? Well, very well taken. And we can go back to those points because those are key points. And we will now go to the chat box. Talaga, parang mali yata, Justin, na napili tayong dalawa mag-chismisan dito for 1 hour. So from Facebook, paano kaya maituro ang malalim na pagmamahal sa kalikasan upang maiwasan ang malalang epekto ng kalamidad? This is a good question now for those who are actually in the teaching, especially basic education? No? What do you think is missing or what can be enhanced?
Ako, mahirap sagutin yung tanong na yan. Uh, kasi alam natin na climate change, talagang directly or indirectly can be attributed to human activity talaga. So the way we the way we use the way we live our lives, no? Travel, the way we use our electricity, yung mga fossil fuels, these are all having a huge impact sa atmosphere natin, sa greenhouse gas emissions. So I think nag-start yan sa talagang from the very young. Doon natin masa-start yan na tuturo natin kung gaano I think kailangan natin ma-realize sa mga bata na hindi sila separate from nature. That that nature and culture are not separate, but we are in that nature and that we are part of that. Yun yung sanang maganda natin maituro, na kasama natin yan sila. Kasama tayo in one community. Parang ganun.
And parang I've heard I've heard a lot of examples of using everyday life as teaching moments, especially for the young when it comes to climate change, looking at and in different contexts also. I mean, I've heard about a little of how Japan does it, or for example, even how sometimes even Ateneo does it, yung doing community mapping, and taking sort of walks to understand the immediate environment and the immediate risks also. So these are all good teaching and learning methodologies.
And one more po, Melissa, if I can add, yung mga individual actions natin, yung mga small actions that we think are insignificant, di ba? The way we pagpapatay natin ng mga tubig, ng mga ilaw. So yung mga small steps na yan that can really help our climate, yun, kailangan natin ituro sa mga bata.
And this one, nakadikit rin to sa tanong na to, pero on the natural science side, paano maituturo sa karaniwang tao ang disiplina at mga konsepto ng biology, chemistry, and physics in practical terms? Nako.
Mahirap. Kaya nga po ko umalis dyan kasi hindi ko po alam yung sagot yun. Yun nga, maganda tanong yan. Paano?
So I think yun nga, parang I think a lot of what is being done now is experiential, no? Para
experiential learning, tama po,
experiential learning, no?
Para and practical.
And lalo na ngayon, you really have to be very creative kasi nga to add pa to the nasa bahay lang sila, di ba? So the whole household pitches in the education of a young person, a young learner now. Ayun. And another question from Facebook. Go ahead, Justin.
Ang hirap naman ng mga tanong.
Pahirap pa yan. Batay sa karanasan mo, Justin, kilala ka. So paanong paraan nakakatulan at nagiging hadlang ang paniniwala or nakagawian ng isang community sa usaping climate justice? Ayun.
Ano kaya? So you mean yung mga beliefs ng mga tao?
Oo, I think if they have beliefs or practices. Ayan. So does it ever become a sort of barrier for climate justice?
I think mahirap din yung tanong na yan. I think it could be, especially kung like it's a difficult question. Di ko I think depende. Siguro kung if you're used ganun, parang sanay ka sa seeing inequality, you're experiencing inequality for 7 years of your life, and you take it as something that's normal and as legitimate, di parang mahirap baguhin, mahirap. But then I think you have to be able to show them the other side, na there's these possibilities na a more fair, a more just, more democratic, more participatory, that their voices can be heard and can be recognized. Pag nakita nila yon, I think na ma-realize nila that they would want justice. They want something more fair in their everyday life.
So talagang kailangan merong space or opportunity na mapag-usapan to. Talagang kailangan dyan ang social sciences. And I know that another colleague of yours, no, of ours, si Isa Mejares, has used methodology such as ARC in order to introduce concepts of climate change adaptation.
Correct.
On to the next question regarding methodologies. Mahirap gumawa ng research ngayon dahil maraming restrictions.
Totoo po yan.
Correct. Ayun, shout out sa nagtanong na ito. Pero kailangan ang PAR. May alternative methodologies ba na participatory rin?
Magandang tanong po yan. Especially kung mga researchers, no, kailangan po isipin, first of all, safety talaga. Kasi anin mo naman yung research mo kung malalagay ka sa alanganin or sa peligro yung buhay mo. So, you have to find a way na yung research na gagawin mo is, yes, it's ethical, but at the same time, kailangan safe rin sa'yo as a researcher. So yun, dahil nga sa maraming restrictions ngayon, mahirap nga gawin ito, no? Ang pagiging being there in person. But if possible, kung pwedeng gawin online, kung possible lang, maganda rin yan na ma-explore monthly catch-ups or basta lang meron nandyan yung presence mo na nakikita ka ng community, regular presence, kanyan. Hopefully matapos na yung pandemic soon so that maging in person na. Pero kung hindi, yun, I think that the presence should be there online na lang muna or I think that would be the alternative to it. But you have to be there, the presence should be consistent. Kailangan nakikita ka nila so that you'll be able to build that rapport and that respect then from the community members themselves.
Ayun. So that's a good comment right there. Lahat tayo po nahihirapan as researchers, no? Or even just, in the different facets of our life now.
Kaya nga po hindi ko ma-imagine, no? Kasi nung buting ginawa ko yung fieldwork ko just right before the pandemic. And I know a lot of researchers now, mga nag-PhD, I know a lot are having a difficult time kasi hindi makapag fieldwork eh. Iba kung, di ba, online and hindi mo naman lahat sa atin may internet, may access to internet. It's difficult talaga na hindi nagagawa in person. So, I feel you guys. I sympathize with you. Patatapos din itong pandemic, makaka-fieldwork din kayo.
Ayan, sa lahat ng mga thesis advice namin, meron pong nakikiramay sa atin. Ayun. And it's so hard kasi parang usually when you do documentation, fieldwork documentation is very rich. And yun talaga yung binabalikan, no? Yung even years later, it looked like this. But now all we have are these squares, no, in Zoom. Ngayon pare-pareho na yung mga picture natin sa Zoom. Ayun, so
especially pag binabalikan mo yung mga pictures, ma-realize mo na nandito may nangyari dito or ito, di ba? Makatulong yun sa sa data analysis mo ngayon, wala na. So
ayun, and I do share your hope fervently that the pandemic will soon end. Ayun. So one comment from Facebook. Ayan, no pressure comment. Salamat sa iyong mapaghamong panukala para sa buklutas ng ating usapin ng adaptation. People empowerment. Salamat, Dr. C. Sana dumami pa ang inyong tribo. Patubayan po kayo ng ating poong may likha.
Salamat po sa comment na yan. Gusto ko lang po sabihin na people empowerment is just one step, no? Kailangan po yung empowerment na yan translates into action. Hindi po pwede na ini-empower lang natin kasi we've been doing that for years. We've been training, we've been capacitating people. The question po is, are they able, after that training, after that capacity building, are people able to shape decision making? Yun po ang gusto natin mangyari, that they're able to given that capability to really influence policy and practice. Yun po yung tanong. Yun yung million-dollar question.
Political scientist in me cannot agree more. Really, what we're looking for is an extended engagement, no? And that doesn't just come from the community side, the side of people, citizens, but also on the side of those in power. So decision makers themselves have to consider the role also in climate justice. Ayun. Merong comment from Jason C. Pa-shoutout po, Dr. Justin.
Kumatin ko po yan.
I-shoutout mo na yung kapatid mo. And baka gusto mo na rin at this point, no? Kasi mag-i-end na rin. Grabe, ang bilis.
Ang bilis ng oras.
Ganyan
Sa oras
talaga
pa rin.
pag nakaupo sa couch ng DSA. You might want to already shout out now to the other people. I think Jessie is in the room.
Oo nga.
Oh, hello, Jessie. Ayun. And from Jeus Cassidy, that's my kuya.
Ayan, another brother ko nanood din. This is a family affair, Melissa. Family affair to. Ayun, shout out sa mga sa mga pamilya ko nanood, sa misis ko, sa anak ko si Chloe, nanood sila at home. Sa Philippines, my parents, mga kapatid ko, nanonood sila. Sa mga friends ko, sa DSA community, ayan, sila Jessie,
Ayan.
sila Andy, sila JP, nanonood sila.
Ayan,
Hello.
si Andy, si JP. Wow! At talagang the last time literally we're here was before the pandemic. And
nga.
Departments are places that are truly missed. Si John
Alanegi rin daw. Oo naman, si John pala
shout
tawa.
out.
At saka si Emily.
Emily Roque. Nako, ito na roll call na to. Ate Burns, wala bang shout out?
Oo nga, Ate Burns. Hello, Ate
Grabe
Burns.
kayo. And of course, to our dean. Sarina Saloma Akbed.
Dean Bopip.
I-shout out mo
Ninyo,
na rin.
Joel.
O si Sir Joel rin daw. Ayun. Nakakamiss nga naman.
Doc Emma, syempre.
Kanina pa yung sinashout. Tama na. Ayun. So, I think at this point, we have to go now back to the title of our program, which is Baka naman Pwede. But at this point, the script is telling me to say thank you sa ating mga kwentuhan sa hapon na ito. And marami po tayong natutunan sa ating pag-uusap. Bago tayo umalis, humihingi muna kami ng konting pabaon para sa ating mga manonood at tagapakinig. Pakikumpleto naman po, Dr. C, ang sentence na ito. Baka naman pwede.
Ayun. Salamat po, Dr. For me, baka naman pwedeng mabigyan pa ng mas malaking atensyon and halaga ang papel na ginagampanan ng agham panlipunan o ng social sciences sa paghahanap sa mga mas patas at mga mas locally appropriate na mga batas at strategiya sa pag-adapt po sa climate change. Kasi based on the literature, no, sa mga aral po natin, nakita natin na ang research po on natural sciences sa magnitude, sa scale, sa dynamics ng climate change, talagang na-overtaken na. Puro 70% po ng research natin is really based on this magnitude, scale, dynamics of climate change. Ang human dimensions ko konti lang po. Wala namang masama dun sa mga studies na yon, but we have to remember that climate change po, this is a wicked, di ba? Yun yung sinasabi, wicked problem. And so this kind of problem, hindi lang po ito masusolusyonan ng natural sciences alone. We need to better understand people themselves kasi tao yung mga naapektuhan nitong climate change. What motivates them? What are their needs? Ano ba yung aspirations nila? Why do they behave in certain way? So when we understand this kind of big questions, then we can be confident that yung mga plano po natin will really reflect the strengths and the assets and the needs of the people.
Ayun. And going back to your 3 points earlier, which actually are captured by your own Baka naman pwede. Number 1, the role of power, the role of these sort of relationships that bring about also inequality, or as you say, climate injustice. Number 2, the role of power, of participation. The role of people and bringing the people to the table for discussion and continued engagement. And then finally, that we look at not just the science side, but also the social science side, that both are equally important in understanding what exactly is climate justice and what exactly do we need in order to fully adapt to the changes of climate that climate change will bring. Ayun. Okay, tama ba? Meron ba akong nakalimutan? Or baka gusto mong i-stress before we move on to closing?
Perfect na perfect po yung sinabi nyo, Dr. Lau, and wala na po kung may dadagdag.
Ayan. Maraming salamat po, Dr. C. At dito nagtatapos ang ating episode ng Baka Naman Pwede. Maraming salamat din sa mga manonood sa Facebook at nakikinig sa Radyo Katipunan. Ayun. And last call na para baka po may gusto kayong idagdag or batiin. Nandito na po sa chat box. Wow, dumadami na ang babatiin natin. So we will take a moment. Shout out, Sheena Kosi, Chloe is watching.
Ano ka po nanonood?
Nanonood.
Hello, Chloe.
Don David Ramos, salamat Doc Justin. Eva Muhal, keep up the good work, Dr. Justin P. Aba.
Thank you po sa inyong suporta. At tuloy lang natin ang laban towards climate justice and just adaptation.
Mukhang mahaba pa ang labanan. Last call na for mga itadagdag or babatiin. But in the meantime, next week, samahan po ninyo kami muli sa Baka Naman Pwede, kung saan pag-uusapan natin ang papel ng effective science communication. Ito na yung last point mo, Justin, on the merging of the natural and the social sciences. Kasama sina Dr. Ines Ponce de Leon at Dr. Maria Consorcia Quizon Lim. Baka naman pwede ninyo ring i-like sa Facebook ang Institute of Philippine Culture para sa iba pa naming announcements at events. Maraming salamat po sa ating mga tagapakinig. Maligayang bagong taon at ingat po tayong lahat. Muli, ito po si Maria Elissa Lau. Melissa Lau. Mag-ingat po tayo at laging tandaan kung may hindi naiintindihan, baka naman pwede nating pag-usapan. Ayun. Salamat po.
Salamat
Thank
po.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you.
Sa
ulitin.
Dapat round table na to. Kasama lahat ng shout out.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede.
Mga isyung napapanahon, ating pag-usapan.
Baka naman pwede.
Gamit ang mga pananaw mula sa iba't ibang kalinangan.
Baka naman pwede.
Mula sa Institute of Philippine Culture, kami inyong samahan, tayo'y maghuntahan. Dito lang sa
Baka naman pwede.
tuwing Huwebes, alas 3 ng hapon, dito lang sa Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM.
Calling on all young male professionals.